if in that respect. Our speaker is going to speak for what, about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, Katrina, and then there'll be the opportunity to ask questions, whether you're in the room or online. It's possible to do it either way. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, who is Katrina Goldstone. Katrina holds degrees from Trinity College Dublin and from Maynooth University. She's an independent researcher. She's written extensively on minorities, cultural diversity, and the Jewish communities in Ireland and elsewhere. She's also been a regular contributor to RTE broadcast programs on Jewish history, Jewish writers, the Holocaust, Anne Frank, cultural diversity, and other literary figures. And her book, which is entitled Irish Writers and the Thirties, Art, Exile and War, was published in December 2020 by Routledge and is available from all good booksellers and hopefully libraries as well.
Yes, that's the idea. Yeah.
So we'd encourage you, if what you hear this afternoon is of interest and stimulating, please follow it up by going and reading Katrina's book. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Katrina, who's going to speak to us this afternoon on her research relating to the topic of the book, specifically today on Leslie Daiken and Michael Sayers, Irish Jewish writers, anti-fascism, the 30s and 40s. So.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's amazing to be here in real life, as the saying goes, and back in Belfast, my hometown. So I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and to be able to go through some of the trajectory of the book, the genesis of the research, some of it which frighteningly, goes back 20 years in terms of when I first heard of Leslie Daiken, for instance. So, and how my initial idea was to write about Leslie Daiken just as a standalone small biography within an idea of local history for the Jewish community, and how through the research and through specifically his own archive, the idea completely morphed and became, went from a study of one man, Leslie Daiken, to a broader study on the relationship of Irish writers on the left, looking at literary form, activism, cultural reinvention. And Daiken led me to the other writers in this book, basically. It's concentrating on himself, Michael Sayers, the poet Ewart Milne, and the poet Charles Donnelly, all of whom were friends and in a loose grouping of other leftist writers and writers interested in left issues in the 30s. And the fact that I wanted to put them not in a local context, but in an international context, interested in how they became part of an international cultural movement, and took part in or were influenced by debates about culture and egalitarianism in the 30s, along with the better known writers like Auden and Spender, but they were also part of what you might call a radical global cultural diaspora. And mainly I focused on their time in London, and then with Michael Sayers, his time in America during the war. So I wanted to find the traces of this hidden cultural history, if you like, to look particular at writers who reacted to the global crises of the 1930s in diverse ways, whether it's through their activism and writing or both. Those, for instance, like Charles Donnelly and Ewart Milne, who went to Spain, Donnelly being killed at the Battle of Jarama, and Ewart Milne working as a medical courier, driving medical supplies for the Spanish Medical Aid Committee. The writers Daiken and Sayers both went to the USSR in the early 30s, and then they became part of a broader group in London who were interested in anti-imperialism, anti-fascism, new forms of cultural expression as part of a move to egalitarianism, or looking at egalitarian ideas in culture. Women, I found far less easy to find archives for. I was very lucky in getting the extensive archive of Leslie Daiken, which really has, broadened the parameters of the book. But when it came to looking for women writers who were on the left, it was much harder to find archives. Either they had already, like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington or Rosamund Jacob, found fine biographers, or there wasn't the type of material, sufficient archival resources to do an in-depth study. But there is a chapter on them, on a few of the lesser-known women writers, and particularly attitudes to Spanish Civil War and women's involvement. So as I've said, without the, well, I'll get you, first of all, we'll have the question, what do they have in common, before I move on. Casino Royale, the early version, not the Daniel Craig, Samuel Beckett and George Orwell, and through the lecture I'll be coming to how both Leslie Daiken, traditional writers pose with cigarette over the typewriter, and there's another cigarette over a typewriter, his friend Michael Sayers at his desk. So I will be weaving together some of the more obvious and not so obvious connections back to the Casino Royale, Orwell and Beckett. That's just to give a summary, their timeline and the various associates. So I keep talking about the archive of Daiken. Who was he? He was a chameleon, and now the jovial toy man writing about history of toys. Also, particularly in the 30s and 40s, the radical leftist writing about the death of Irish workers in England, and the Jewish writer trying for decades to produce the Irish Jewish novel and managing eventually only work in progress extracts and a radio play. Despite encouragement from friends Samuel Beckett and poet Austin Clarke, he never managed to complete that book. As I've said, Daiken led me to Michael Sayers, who's a much different character and who in the war years took up investigative popular journalism, looking into access infiltration in America, and I'll discuss his book and his role in exposing some of these secretive groups in America later in the lecture, and flag up themes about the journalism, poetry, why I think that their lives and experience is significant in expanding our concept of Irish cultural history, and also broadening what we think about Irish writers' place in a cultural history of English-speaking writers in the 30s. So it's not totally accidental that two of the writers of the quartet are Jewish, since initially I began considering over 20 years ago, I had a research question that I wanted an answer for, which was, where are the radical Jews in the Dublin community? And it was something of a, at times, frustrating search until I interviewed Daiken's brother, and I eventually got access to his archive. I was curious to see why there seemed to be so few politically committed socialists in the small Irish Jewish community. And Daiken seemed to be one of the few, and also because of his cultural activism, I was fascinated by him. He was born in Dublin in 1912 to Samuel and Rosie Daiken, and the family genealogist says that the Daiken family were, like many of the Irish Jewish community in the early 20th century, from former parts of Lithuania. He attended Trinity, graduated in 1934, and not long after that moved to London, where he lived for most of his life while still retaining great affection for Ireland and returning regularly either to join the other writers in the Palace Bar or for holidays with the actor Cyril Cusack. He maintained a huge affection for Ireland, and in some of his really quite unlikely poems, he writes with great affection of the landscape of Ireland. He loved Wicklow, and his ashes were scattered over Boher na Brina. At the time of his death, his obituaries focused on this sort of lively Pickwickian figure. They had him portrayed as a kind of a jovial toy man. He was a lecturer in the University of Ghana. That was his last job. But during his lifetime, he was variously a journalist, broadcaster, educator, filmmaker, poet, and cultural renegade. And to get a few bob together, he often wrote PR blurb for tourist magazines, Let's Go to Ireland, in this type of genre, and wrote about caravan holidays in Ireland to get the few bob. But what was fascinating about what was hidden in the obituaries was that they basically completely obscured his role in 30s political and cultural circles. And there was no mention really of him, particularly his relationship with small groups of left-wing Republicans in Ireland's radical cultural diaspora in London. Brian O'Neill, the Irish press journalist, observed, "He was always busy, always with a half-dozen irons in the fire, always trying to give a hand to some Irish writer who needed it." Indeed, his correspondence full of tips and advice to other writers from matters as how to get into a certain anthology, or how to get papers, their archive papers, to different universities. But Daiken also affords us rare insights into the position of Irish Jews in the 20th century through some of his own writings, influenced by his upbringing and experience. And I'll come to his plays later. In 1998, I came across a book by the German academic H. Gustav Claus, Strong Words, Brave Deeds, about the life of Thomas O'Brien, poet and Spanish Civil War international brigadier. And he argued that Daiken was within a small group of left-wing poets, and Irish left-wing poets in the 30s, who, as Claus put it, had been wiped off the literary map. And so through this juncture of looking at the archives, reading of Claus, various other writers such as Emmett O'Connor, I began to see that Daiken's role was possibly not merely as an oddbod or eccentric within his own community as such, but he had another significance if one placed him in the context of broader 30s cultural movements. And this move to London, where Daiken and Ewart Milne and Donnelly are all milling around intersecting cultural circles between either Left Review, which Charles Donnelly wrote for, little Irish Republican news sheets, which Donnelly and Daiken edited together, or in the case of Sayers, a much more mainstream cultural publication like the Criterion. Andy Croft wrote of the era in 30s Britain, this cultural moment when the quartet are in the thick of it. It was a generous moment, a critical and creative intervention that sought to be constructive, to build a broad and popular, imaginative and intellectual alliance against unemployment, poverty, bad housing, dangerous working conditions, educational waste, and to isolate the intellectual forces of the enemy. As Gerald Daw argued in relation to a broader group of Irish poets in the 30s, the poets who started out in the early 30s went on to probe and explore many different avenues, their language and styles challenging what was conventional and orthodox in the poetry of the time. Historian Emmett O'Connor highlighted Daiken's anthology of proletarian poetry, which he edited, Goodbye Twilight, Song of the Struggle. And O'Connor viewed Daiken's book as symbolic in the cultural realm of something of a popular front atmosphere in the early 30s in Ireland. That's the appreciation on his death, this idea of support for the underdog, which runs through so much. And here you have, he's right over the one woman in the group. he's got the sort of trench coat on and a little horn-rimmed glasses. Irish Republicans greet Spanish Republicans, smash all imperialisms. That's at a demonstration, and Ewart Milne is at the very end here with the fedora or Homburg. So this is Daiken in with the Irish Republican group at a demonstration. And then this is him on his way to Leningrad, showing his knees on board the SS Cooperativa. And he met Patrick Breslin in the Moscow news offices, an Irishman who later died in the Gulag. So as part of the sort of political education, Daiken went to Russia. Sayers also went to Russia. That's with his brother. Sayers is on the dark-haired chap here. So there's a panoply of both political and cultural influences that they're imbibing at this time, and all with focusing or debating about methods to combat anti-fascism, looking at internationalism and not nationalism in the 30s. Now, as I've said, Daiken tended to be in the mid-30s amongst more radical Republican groups. Now, Michael Sayers took a different path, though he also held leftist views, but he would argue with Daiken that he was too doctrinaire, and Sean Sayers, Michael Sayers' son, would say he always considered himself a Jew on the left, but with a great deal of ambivalence. And in this period of the mid to late 30s, he is moving in far different circles. He's come from a more affluent background. His father, Philip Sayers, was a businessman, and he is reputed to have hidden Michael Collins in the Sayers house during the independence struggle. This was in the family lore of the Sayers family, but it's also in military archives, a footnote to say, left Michael Collins off at Phil Sayers' house. So this is the sort of slightly different background he's coming from, whereas Daiken's father was a sort of a scrap merchant, rubber merchant, selling tires and rubber. He did also go to Trinity, and like Daiken, this is where he met Samuel Beckett. And he's in London from early, at least 1930, encouraged by T.S. Eliot, whom he had the audacity, as a 17, 18-year-old, to write to with some of his youthful poems. And in fact, it was Eliot who made lots of introductions for him, got him to write for the Criterion, a mainstream influential cultural publication, and also for New English Weekly, where he was eventually introduced to a young writer known professionally as George Orwell. Now, Sayers would take a very different course towards the end of the 30s, leave this quite, he's getting quite a lot of attention. He's been published in the best short stories anthology. He's been encouraged by Eliot. And then suddenly he's off. He takes off. He goes to America, 1937. And a whole different path opens up. He's interested in theatre and seeks to train with Norman Bell Geddes. But he's also writing for some radical magazines like the New Masses. And then he will go on to write 3 popular books about these sort of tabloid investigative journalism, and then join NBC to work in TV. And the past then catches up with him in the blacklist era. He was informally blacklisted because of one of his books in the war was perceived as pro-Soviet. He didn't get called up, but he was literally told in a corridor, no, we can't employ you anymore. And any work he did after that, in terms of writing, he normally did under a pseudonym, Michael Connor. So they've gone to this ferment, cultural ferment, but what they left behind as part of the push factor as to why they went, not just to get jobs to go to London, but this idea of a new cultural circles and people of like minds, because they've come from, first of all, Daiken and Sayers as minorities, as Jews in a small regional community in the 1930s, have got or are up against various barriers. The 30s is, of course, marked by violence, particularly in the early years, clashes between the groups from the Army Comrades Association, and also known as the Blue Shirts. It's a very febrile atmosphere, and as well as that, there is coming up an amplification of anti-Semitic discourse coming through different, either through religious publications, sometimes from sermons from the pulpit. So this is part of the background to how they left and what they were going from, if you like. They're part of a small provincial community where literary ambitions are not necessarily regarded positively. They've a desire to meet a greater variety of cultural and political soulmates. And then there's the strand of stereotyping around Bolshevik Jews, which can be in newspapers or can, as I say, come through religious sermons. Now, Daiken was 11 when the murders of 2 Jewish men took place in 1923, October and November. And the incident caused fear and no small amount of panic in the Jewish community. Daiken later incorporated a version of the events. It's not exactly the same, but he incorporated an angle not dissimilar in his radio play, The Circular Road, based on the Jewish district of Dublin in the 20s. The victim is caught in crossfire, not shot deliberately as the 2 original victims in 1923 were. So that's to give a flavour of what it was they were coming through. As Jews on the left in 30s Ireland, they would have been aware, no doubt, of some of the more extreme rhetoric. As argued by Ray Douglas, he stated that the sheer volume of anti-Semitic rhetoric present in the political and intellectual discourse of independent Ireland before 1945 is striking and can be readily observed by anyone with an afternoon to spare, leafing through the provincial press of the first half of the 20th century. These negative attitudes constituted a real concern for Irish Jewish communal leaders, anxious to dispel pernicious stereotypes about the Bolshevik Jew. In a Passover address in 1934, Rabbi Isaac Herzog objected publicly to attempts to associate Jews with communism, and in private correspondence with Archbishop Edward Byrne, he strongly deplored the anti-Jewish rhetoric of certain Irish Catholic publications, which cast Jews in the role of communist subversives. So he did this in private correspondence, and there's a small amount of these interventions and intercessions in Archbishop Byrne's papers, where he's directly approached by Herzog. Now, in terms of, that's local context, in terms of what they were looking outward to the political crises in Europe, and how, in terms with, along with other intellectuals, their fears and anxieties about the rise of Hitlerism. Margot Heinemann recalled the atmosphere as it developed in early 30s cultural circles. The impact, she said, of Hitler's coming to power on European intellectuals was immediate and profound. Some writers were fascinated or even attracted by this radical solution for what they saw as a corrupt, decadent civilization. But far more were repelled, angry, or frightened, especially after the ceremonial burning of books in 1933. The onslaught on decadent, in quotes, avant-garde art, the victimization of Jewish and progressive intellectuals, all in what was supposed to be one of the most advanced countries. But Heinemann also described a hope, possibility, and a sense of purpose generated at this time in cultural circles amongst those who thought that they needed to do something to fight against fascism, particularly further galvanized by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Daiken, too, vividly recalled in an unpublished tribute to his friend, poet Charlie Donnelly, their time in London as heroic days of dream and struggle, and recalled a frenetic time when life was one long continuum of agit-prop. So they're into the maelstrom. Daiken goes off standing at Speaker's Corner giving speeches. He and Donnelly are writing these political newsletters, writing about the terrible conditions for Irish workers. Whole ferment of activity. And not only do they find when they get to London that they have like-minded souls, but there is also the possibility of being recognised by mentors or literary heroes, such as Sayers when he caught the attention of T.S. Eliot. One of his first letters, here is Eliot writing to Sayers in the summer of 1930 with advice for the fledgling writer. Read as much as you can on any subjects outside of poetry that interest you, but don't try to work your reading into your verse until it comes in naturally of itself. Don't bother whether to accept or reject me or Joyce or Proust. We are all utterly different anyway, and probably quite different from what you think we are. Don't bother about your direction. You say that if you follow me, you must discard sound. That is bosh. I have taken as much trouble over sound as anybody, and you are not to worry about following or not following anyway. Get all the fun out of life you decently and morally can in your own particular circumstances. Send me some more verses in 6 months' time, and then come and see me and have a talk about it. So Sayers is finding a kind of encouragement he just couldn't have found if he'd remained. And he's quickly into, mainstream cultural circles, writing for the New England English Weekly. He's focusing on drama criticism. This is where he meets Orwell and another writer, Rainer Hempenstall, who recalled the era in a memoir called Four Absentees. Crick noted, by 1935, Orwell, through friends like Michael Sayers and the Westrups, was being introduced more and more to advanced left-wing thinking. They ended up taking a flat together, Hempenstall and Sayers and Orwell, off the Kentish town High Street. And in that memoir, Four Absentees, there's a vivid description of this sort of bohemian milieu of the time. And Sayers was also one of the first. He wrote an early review, an assessment of Orwell in his review of Burmese Days in the Adelphi magazine in August 1935, and identifying, he homes in on his portrayal of the lives of imperialist officials, but also on the quality of his prose, heralding the beginning of acknowledgements of this window pane quality of Orwell's writing. He was less enamoured of agitprop or leftist aesthetics than Daiken, but nonetheless he contemplated writing a progressive novel even in the 30s. As I said, the two fell out over politics, and writing to Daiken in 1937, Sayers said, "Must you stuff your letters to me with a moralism that is no less nauseating because it is conveyed in the orthodox terminology of the Communist Party instead of the equally orthodox terminology of John Smiles?" So they literally fall out, and according to Sean Sayers, all the Daiken's letters, many letters to Sayers were thrown out or burnt or whatever, whereas some correspondence remains in Sayers' archive in the Bodleian. So just at the end of the 30s, these two Irish Jewish writers, they're coming from very different places, but also increasingly seeing the rise of Nazism and looking at different forms, literary, journalistic, polemical, to resist fascism and anti-Semitism, whilst navigating complex identities as Jews on the left, originally from a small community. So Daiken begins in 1939 to write semi-autobiographical extracts, which are supposed to be flagging a novel that will work in progress. And they were published in the Dublin magazine between 1939 and 1945. He later returned to some of the themes of the extracts by reconstituting them as a radio script, and the play was broadcast on the BBC in 1960 and Radio Éireann in 1962. He was making multiple attempts at self-expression, crafting a rare wry insider view of a Jewish Dublin of old, paying affectionate tribute to his family and community. There was not just nostalgia, but also as a secular Jewish socialist, he emphasized in terms of social context, his Jewish neighbors. He was comical in tone and also quietly critical of petty snobberies and internal communal wrangles. His tone is a humane one, nevertheless, flying in the face of image of Jews as exploiter or subversive. He is trying to create more complex characters and more lively and nuanced characters. He produced his only volume of poetry in 1945, Signatures of All Things, and he actually wrote the blurb for the book himself, which I think sums up how he frames himself as an anti-fascist, and the blurb was published in the Irish Democrat in October 1945. This new collection of Daiken's work represents two distinct epochs in Irish experience. The pre-war years are reflected in themes ranging from landscapes to such poems of the Depression as Lament for Sean Reardon and Song of a Man on the Dole. The war years are represented by the author's experience as a private in the era army. Throughout is the consistent anti-fascist feelings of the writer who has scorned to retreat into the ivory tower. This is how he's framing himself. He's having, in this only poetry standalone publication, he's got his workers' rights poems, he's got poems dealing with Irish landscape, he's got the banality of evil in poems on, for instance, one on Heydrich, who he calls the blondest of all the sadists who ever killed for joy. And within a year of 1945, Daiken would visit displaced persons camps and see for himself the remnants of European Jewry as he took part in education by the International Refugee Organization, efforts to help people in those camps. So by this stage, both of our writers are motivated, galvanized to seek ways to express Jewish identity in very different ways. Sayers with his investigative journalism, his book, The Plot Against America, Sabotage, The Plot Against America, co-authored with Albert E. Kahn. And that looks back to the years of the 30s when there were various fascist groups and attempts by these groups to infiltrate into American organizations. And Sayers focused, along with Kahn, with their research on how these native fascists spread propaganda blaming all social and economic ills on the Jews, and asserted that the New Deal was a Jewish communist plot to rob Americans of their independence. And he produced 3 of these tabloid journalism books with Kahn. As I say, the first one is the one that's focusing on shining a light on very nefarious groups. Now, Daiken, advised by Beckett, after he does his radio play, he now goes back and says he's going to try and do a manuscript, encouraged by Beckett. And here is a letter from April 1961 that Beckett wrote to him. Dear Yod, which was one of his nicknames, thanks for your letters and poem, which I do not find at all whimsy, but authentic and moving. Anything rather than the Innisfree junk. Bravo. I'm sorry to hear of rejection of the CR, Circular Road. Don't be cast down. That is one rejection. I suggest you show it to John Calder, telling him it is my idea and telling him of the BBC production. Now that's 1961, and he takes advice. He sends it to various, that's one of his books. There's the types of writing, Daiken and Sayers, and at this point, now this is Sayers at the end of his life. Daiken doesn't get the manuscript published, and it's in the possession of his son-in-law in London. There is a draft manuscript. Sayers, with the years of sort of in exile because of the blacklist, he doesn't come back to America till 1980s. And Gordon Boker, who did also do work on Orwell, considered doing a biography of Sayers because he found his life picaresque and wanted to write further on him. But Sayers sort of wriggled away from him and wasn't that keen on cooperating. But Boker said at the end of his life, he spoke of his persecution with realism and resignation. I mean, he lived in the 90s. Gentle, humorous man who, like many gifted writers of his generation, paid the price for having the wrong opinions at the wrong time in the wrong place, and whose career never quite recovered from the setback. Now, he did get asked to come in as a part script writer on the Casino Royale script, which had about 5 or 6 other people trying to cobble it together for the 1967 film. And the DVDs, if people remember what DVDs are, still have Sayers' credit on the back for the screenplay, which is amazing because he regarded it as, you know, something, a sort of piecework that he'd done along with about 5 or 6 other writers, and he wasn't that pushed about it. That's the photograph of the manuscript that's in the possession of Patrick Cumming in London that he was sending round, and the response sending him elsewhere, which he didn't, by the time of his death in 1964, excuse me, he hadn't managed to get a publisher. And as I say, it remains in draft form in London in an attic. So I think I'll wrap it up there and get some questions, hopefully from the floor and from people in the audience and online.
Katrina, thank you very much for that. That was wonderful, really fascinating. Do come and join me here, and we'll take some questions.
Aye.
Let's just turn the camera on so people can see you. There we are. We'll just turn off the presentation. Stop presenting. Great. Okay. So, now, as I said before, we have a mixture of people in the room and also online. So, people in the room, quite easily just raise your hand to ask a question. People out there in the ether, you can electronically raise your hand if you're using Teams. There's a little icon which has a little face and a hand on it. If you press on that, and then press on the kind of open palm hand icon, that will just indicate you want to ask a question. So feel free to do that. So let's start. Sean is here with us. So Sean, go ahead. Fascinating tour to the last 50 while. I just want to ask you about a couple of connections.
Yes.
But there are a lot of discussion in recent years about T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism.
Yes.
I wonder if that's going to be an issue between them and Sarah. Of course, the great cause labor of the time of a great writer on anti-Semitism was Ezra Pound.
Yes.
And I wanted to leave him on the deal with that.
He had to go at Ezra Pound, all right.
The other connection that undoubtedly is, of course, the University of Ghana.
Sorry?
The University of Ghana.
Yes.
He was vice chancellor in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Yes. And I
yes.
wonder that I would do with Daiken's appointment there. So
I'll start with that because it did, and really Conor Cruise O'Brien saved Daiken after a period of ill health and financial problems, and basically Conor Cruise O'Brien got him to come over to the University of Ghana to help set up and initiate an audiovisual department, and particularly with Daiken's expertise on film. He'd done film about street games, which is on a BFI DVD. So he totally saved Daiken at a very, very grim period, I have to say. And apparently Daiken loved it out there. He was making a film called The Piano, which was going to go to the Cork Film Festival. And he came home in the summer of 1964, went upstairs, told his wife he wasn't feeling that well, and he died in the night of some heart-related issue. And shocking to a lot of people at the time. He was 52. But no, Conor Cruise O'Brien was a great friend to him, and really, it's hard to express how at a really, when he was in the depths, Conor Cruise O'Brien said, right, now, he knew that Daiken had expertise. He wasn't doing it, totally out of charity, but that's the connection there. Now, Michael Sayers' entire papers has now gone to the Bodleian, right? Now, I never saw, though he did have a correspondence where he berates Ezra Pound and he takes Ezra Pound on. But in any of the letters I ever saw in relation to himself and Eliot, I never saw any evidence of him challenging him or having, in any way referring to the anti-Semitic content. No, he is nothing I have seen would indicate. But I do know that he definitely took on Ezra Pound, and there is an exchange. Leslie Daiken also writes to Nancy Cunard about Ezra Pound, and that's in an archive in the States, basically saying, here he is evidence of his friends, the fascists, have been here. She's writing from France. So I never got to see the broader archive, but certainly I didn't see him ever taking on Eliot, and the youthful enthusiasm of the early letters is really appreciation more than anything else. So, yes.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, other questions either online, people online, or in the room? Ian?
Thank you. I have two questions. I have two questions, if possible. Just one, neither of these men neither ever joined the Communist Party. Is that right?
Well, there is a Garda report that says that Daiken was in the Communist Party of Ireland, and they're sort of secret reports. In the early 1930s, Department of Justice was very much terrified about the communistic turn of the IRA, and obviously there's surveillance, and in one of these meetings there's talk about Daiken, Yo Daiken, as he was called then, and Down has been a member of the CPI. When he gets to London, I haven't seen, there's nothing in the archive of any showing a membership of the Communist Party, but he's with the sort of people he's friendly with, Edgell Rickard, Montague Slater. He's in that broader group without necessarily being signed up, from what I can see.
So there's a bit of a drift rather than a break.
Yes. I suppose, from what I can gather, in some of the books, like Andy Croft's book about writers in the 30s and Margot Heinemann's essay about left review and new writing, it's both Milne and Daiken are in with groups of writers who are committed communists, and they're in some cases collaborating with Milne, who who later went right over to the right, you know, was friendly and was writing for publications that had, you know, at least a communist influenced editor, for instance. But there's very little evidence. Sayers perceives and aroused with Daiken because he believes that he's too far to the left for his taste. So
this is the other thing I was curious about, whether or not any of them express opinions or write analysis of Ulysses, the other possible Jewish.
Well, Daiken loved Ulysses, and in one of the appreciations, I think it's Brian O'Neill saying it's a pity that he never wrote the study. That was one of the things that he never found the time. I mean, he's living a very frenetic life, often hand to mouth between one thing and the other. But he had a huge admiration for Joyce, and did sort of float ideas about doing a study, because you know he had an academic side in terms of street rhymes and language, and he I'm sure he could have, but also this drive to try and self-actualize, if you like, through his own experience, or in some way to put on the page something that would be an actual, you know, novel by an Irish Jewish person as opposed to a character, if you know what I mean. But at the same time, loving Joyce and Bloom, and certainly conversing about it enough that people thought he would one day get round to a study. But it never happened, like quite a lot of other things.
Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, Virgil, yeah.
Do the same. That was really interesting, Katrina. Just picking up on Sean's point about a kind of lost world. I mean, I wonder to what extent some of this, our lack of knowledge of these areas, is because we kind of have really historians have a kind of methodological nationalism about work, which is they're kind of interested in things happening in Ireland and what Irish people do in Ireland and so on. And if we want to kind of write the history of a kind of an Irish 1930s radicalism or popular front or kind of a progressionist, we sort of have to do it somewhere else.
Yes.
To a large extent. We're not, sometimes not very good at doing that. And the other kind of point or question I wanted to ask was, I mean, obviously, you sketch out how there's all sorts of intellectual affinities and opportunities and so on that lie elsewhere, so they're important kind of push factors. I'm just wondering about the sort of the actual kind of more practical aspects of how you go about your business if you want to be an activist or a writer, and there's just very few kind of print outlets for that in Ireland and how relevant that is, because one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of write a history of debates about modernity in the 1930s, and always have to go outside Ireland, either to correspondence or to periodicals, because the Catholic grid is so strong. I mean, with the exception of maybe a few issues of something like the Irish Democrat or Ireland Today. Before the bells, just nothing there. So I'm just wondering, that's a very practical point. It's all sort of, we must reconstruct this world outside Ireland and try and think about, I mean, what are the implications that there just really isn't a public discourse in Ireland in the same way that there is in Britain about all these issues, which have shown that Irish people are actually interested in? Yeah, well, the practical point of view, I mean, they weren't going to have any publishing outlets, you know, for for ideas, you know. I mean, Milne obviously wrote in Ireland Today, and Charlie Donnelly had his, you know, one and only poem published. But I mean, it's very hard to actually get across how narrow and obviously how difficult it was, because they weren't going to get any pay for anything. And the fact that these debates about a politically committed literature, which are, you know, vivid and lively when they go into London, it's not that they're totally aware of them, but where are they going to put them? Because, you know, and as you know, I mean, Emmett O'Connor's written about the sort of grip of, you know, Catholic publications. Where are the outlets going to be unless you do send it somewhere else, or you go to the other place where there are, you know, the Left Review, New Writing, any number of publications. Daiken is published by the communist imprint Lawrence and Wishart, his Goodbye
Twilight anthology. I mean, he could never have hoped to get that published in Ireland. He just couldn't have, and yet he's hitting on a moment there. Lawrence and Wishart are looking for this type of content. Now he got roasted over some of the content. He didn't get good reviews, and this idea that he was trying to conceive of an Irish proletarian poetry. I mean, he was literary guffaws. Were some of the responses in the reviews, but it's literally like going from one pond to another. Where in the London scenario, there's various outlets, and you can get paid as well with various jobs of regular journalism, so you can get some kind of freelance work and then do your activism printing or your articles as well. And of course they're living on air as well. But I think, I mean, we're already seeing, I mean, what you're looking at, aren't we seeing a broadening out to say, let's look at an Irish cultural diaspora and not just limit it? Because then when you start to put that as a frame, then you can see how to locate this and see that. And of course, the people are in touch with one another. They're not, they're not segregated away. He's always coming back to Ireland to go down to the Palace Bar and chat. And then in London, he's in Irish Republican circles. And also, I mean, you can see from the correspondence of somebody like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington with the groups in America. So again, on the left, looking at campaigns, Free, Tom Mooney, any of these, you can, if you sort of open it out, but it's damned hard because in terms of actual sources, because you have to scrabble around for sure and find them in unlikely places sometimes, but.
I mean, it also maybe, like, sometimes I think we get a bit too hung up on censorship and what was censored, when the really significant thing is that the fact that people couldn't even produce this stuff in the first place because there's such an informal kind of censorship culture. But I'm wondering, kind of, do you get much evidence that people like your subjects are actually surveilled and monitored, and Catholic organisations are collecting information that maybe preventing them having commercial opportunities working in mainstream media or 40A, that kind of thing? Because I've certainly come across some of these names in like Catholic archives, or more head-to-ball figures like Father Fahey's and anti-communist streams.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's an issue of Left Review that talks about having the copies confiscated. They were trying to get them into Ireland. I wanted to get into, and was talking to Una O'Halpin about getting into the Kew archives. I didn't get to that. Certainly there's various letters of Irish people that indicate they believe that their post is open. For instance, Maureen Mitchell, who wrote Storm Over Spain, writes to Hannah Sheehy Skeffington about be careful what you're writing to me, and also surveillance of Irish publications. And I mean, she sounds totally paranoid. I mean, I'm not saying that she's not justified, but you see this saying, be careful when you're sending me such and such a thing, as I say, there's another reference to Left Review being confiscated, and you have that amusing article by Pat Dooley in the Left Review talking about selling books in Ireland and how there's this idea, it is a censorship of being looked at because you've got some left-wing publication you're trying to sell on a stall or something. It's written as an amusing piece, but I have no doubt that created atmosphere where people believed they were being surveyed for sure.
We have Guy Biner with us online.
Hello, Guy.
Who's indicated he wants to ask a question. So, Guy, you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hello, Katrina. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
All right. I wanted to congratulate you, first of all, because this is a remarkable work of painstaking recovery of a lot of lost history, or what you call hidden history. And I can understand, in line with Fergal's question now, I think it's understandable why it was written out, why it was obscured, why it didn't make it into the Irish cultural literary canon. I can see that, even though it's interesting that these writers all have entries in the DIB, right? So, you know, thanks to people like Paul Rouse and Patrick Moom and others, you know, there's some kind of recognition out there, even prior to your book. And of course, they have careers which are transnational. People like Michael Sayers reinvented themselves in the cooperation with Khan, gave him a whole new reputation, which is international. But what I'm wondering is this. Do you see in the climate of today, and this is maybe a question about how you see the reception of your book, maybe it's too early to say, do you see now a rediscovery? I mean, these are the kind of people who, in many ways, Irish literary history needs to enrich itself and to see a richer picture. Do you see this kind of recognition, on the one hand, on the part of kind of Irish studies, Irish literary canons being revised, and on the other hand, the internal story, which you've just touched on briefly, of the Jewish community keeping them at an arm's breadth, you know, not feeling comfortable with them and writing them out. Is this going to change now?
Oh, Guy, you always ask the spot-on question that it never has an easy answer. And I thank you very much for doing that. The short answer is, I don't know. I'm beginning, you know, the book came out in the pandemic, and I've pushed it in certain quarters. Sometimes there's a half open door, sometimes there isn't. So I tell you what I hope, partially, because really what's a lot of what I'm doing is it's not just the recovering, because I want for people to recognize a continuity. I want not to feel that these are siloed off, so that we get a new picture of a cultural history of small groups. I mean, I'm not going to say that they were, overwhelmingly popular or recognized, but I think there's a continuity. But because we don't have a standalone 30s social history, even we don't even have a big, you know, proper social history of the 30s in Ireland. There's number one. I mean, I say that, you know, like a proper general history. You know, sometimes I get, oh, I've never heard of them and this and that, whatever. Look, that goes with the territory. That's fine. But I would hope that we can, decade by decade, begin to assemble. I know that Elaine Sisson is doing some work on countercultural scene in the 20s. There's the young guys doing stuff on the 40s. Instead of just saying this silo, just trying to create this continuity thread. I can't say that I'm hugely optimistic necessarily, but I keep banging on about it. And as you say, when you have got something like the DIB, that is a start. Sayers' papers are in the Bodleian. Anybody who wants to go and do a biography, please go and do it, because there's another archive now that would bring in his story, which is picaresque, really. I've only been able to touch on some of it. So I'm quietly something exhausted, I think is the word, but hopeful that at least it's there. And if it could begin debate, you know, to say, look, there's continuity. It wasn't always just this narrow. There were other groups who were always trying, certainly from 20s on, whether it's through culture, through masked balls of the 20s, all this whole. Harry Kernoff is involved in graphic art and design in the 20s for these occasions. So there's a thread that can go on. What up to the 50s, certainly. 50s I don't know enough about, but the 20s, 30s, 40s, I think there's enough there. But it is a huge amount of work. I won't say that it isn't, and it is painstaking. And unfortunately now, a lot of people have so many other pressures that to go and do the sort of digging, you know, real digging is you know, it's not going to be something that everybody can do, I suppose. But it's great to see you, and thank you very much. And I'll be in touch about cultural memory next week.
Thank you, Guy. That's great. Do we have any other questions, either in the room or from people online? No? Okay. Or if anyone online is having trouble finding the icon, just unmute yourself and ask your question directly now. That will be fine.
Oh, somebody's typing.
Someone's typing something. No, okay. Oh, all right. Well, look, I think this has been a great session. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It's been really revelatory, Katrina, and it's been an ideal flag for the importance of the book that you published. I'm sure many of us will now go away and seek it out and read it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it and to share with the Institute's community.
So if I can ask just everyone, perhaps both here in the room and also online, if you want to unmute yourselves, just to give Katrina a round of applause in the traditional fashion. And for those of you, again, both in the room and online, so we do have another seminar next Monday, if you're interested. We have our own Gail McConnell from the School of English here in Queens, who's going to talk about her most recent poetry publications, very deeply autobiographical piece. The title of her talk is A Grammar in Which Everything is Significant, which is a quotation from Kieran Carson, Poems and Reflections from The Sun is Open. Which is her most recent collection. So it'll be 4:30 next Monday. We have the Eventbrite already up if you want to register for that. I hope to see some of you in person or online. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. And goodbye to everyone who's joined us online. We'll catch you again sometime soon, hopefully.